The conference is called Singapore and a Rising Asia. And of course, the morning was very much all about Singapore. And I hope all of you had a chance to get out to those very interesting sessions. I attended one that was very lively. And we just had Mr. Giorgio really lift our sights almost to a philosophical plane, indeed to a philosophical plane, but really to look at very huge issues at a global level. Although in the end, and particularly in the Q&A, I think you saw him traverse from a micro level, that is Singapore, all the way up to very big global issues. This session brings the sights down somewhat, that is to Asia. And we have two very fine guests here, very fine speakers and scholars with us, great commentators. I'm just going to introduce them very briefly while Joe gets wired up. I think he wants to be wired up. Are we wiring him up? The wiring's on its way. Let me begin by introducing Roger Cohen then, in the meantime. Roger joined the New York Times in 1990. He was a foreign correspondent for more than a decade before becoming foreign editor on a rather fateful day, September the 11th, 2001, and became foreign editor 6 months later. Since 2004, he's written a column for the International New York Times until 2013, known as the International Herald Tribune. First for the news pages, and then from 2007 onwards for the op-ed page. And since 2009, he's been a columnist of the New York Times. Roger's written several books, Hearts Grown Brutal, Sagas of Sarajevo, which was published by Random House in 1998. And this is an account of the wars of Yugoslavia's destruction. Another book is Soldiers and Slaves, American POWs Trapped by the Nazis' Final Gamble, published by Knopf in 2005. He's co-written a biography of General Norman Schwarzkopf of Gulf War fame, In the Eye of the Storm, and this was published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux in 1991. And very interestingly, a much more personal book, a family memoir, The Girl from Human Street, Ghosts of Memory in a Jewish Family, also published by Knopf, to be released in January 2015. Joe's back with us. Joe Studwell is co-founder of the China Economic Quarterly and the author of several works as well. He's worked as an author, commentator, and academic researcher in East Asia for more than 20 years, so he's no stranger to these parts. From 1997 to 2007, Joe was the founding editor of the China Economic Quarterly. His latest book is How Asia Works, Success and Failure in the World's Most Dynamic Region. This was published in March of 2013. The Financial Times reviewer wrote, Studwell's thesis is bold, his arguments persuasive, and his style pugnacious. So we may see some of that pugnacity today, but it adds up to a highly readable and important book. How Asia Works is now going to be published in Chinese as well. As well as writing many books, he's done increasing amounts of academic research and teaching at the universities of Bristol and Cambridge in the UK, and has been employed as a consultant by UNCTAD. He's currently based in Cambridge, doing research at the Judge Business School there, and doing a PhD. So he will be a fully certified member of the scholarly community pretty soon. And his thesis focuses on state-firm relations in conditions of effective industrial policy in China. So, without further ado, let me first invite Roger Cohen to come up and speak, and his topic is Resurgent America, an Essential 21st Century Power. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kanti. Thank you, Kishore, for this invitation to speak on this auspicious anniversary. I spend a lot of my time, most of my time, in a depressed Europe and a war-torn Middle East. So you can't imagine what a fillip it is to be in what Giorgio just called this happy half of the world. to be in a place where on the 10th anniversary of an institution, one's already looking forward to the 20th anniversary, rather than dwelling on what went wrong 10 or more years ago. I should start with a warning, and the warning is this. I'm going to be talking about the United States in Asia, and you should bear in mind that I'm a newly minted American. I only became an American less than 10 years ago, and I've not quite yet rubbed the stardust from my eyes. I tend to believe in the beneficence of American power, whatever the evidence to the contrary, and there has been quite a lot since 9/11. When I became an American citizen, I had to do an English test. And the English test consisted of a dictation, consisted in part of a dictation. And the first sentence I had to write out was, "I want to be a good American. I want to be a good American." I wrote it out. She said, "Yes, that's correct. Are you ready for the second sentence?" "Yes," I said. "I plan to work very hard every day. No day of rest, no Sabbath, no nothing." And I thought to myself, well, this is a nation that inculcates its fundamental values very early on. And I was thinking of this on arrival here in Singapore when my taxi driver told me that he works 14 to 16 hours every day and gets a maximum of 5 hours sleep a night. And he had to do this in order to support his family, support his son, support his father. He was divorced. He also did some stickering on a taxi. And he told me of an incident where he had a rendezvous with his girlfriend. But every day he sets himself a target of how much money he has to earn in that day before he can go off work. And he was 10 Singapore dollars short of that target. And he knew his girlfriend was waiting, but he took the decision that he had to wait for this fare before going to meet her. Well, not surprisingly, when he got there, late, very late, she was angry, and she pushed a $20 bill into his face and said, "I'm more valuable than money." And he said to me, "No, that's wrong. If you waver, if you falter in your goals, then you open the floodgates. You have to hold fast. You have to work hard." So I think clearly a very powerful work ethic does link not only Singapore and the United States, but also Asia and the United States in general. And I don't think that the Asian dream and the American dream are that far apart in their essentials. In Europe, as you know, it's somewhat of another story. I think in France, to say that you intend to work a 14-hour day on a regular basis is to merit a certificate of insanity. But for all that binds, that I've just described, there is a fraying that no Alibaba magic can hide. And on recent visits to Asia and Vietnam, I've been struck by the chorus. That's to say that the United States, far from pivoting to Asia, is devoting less attention to Asia. The pivot to Asia is merely an empty phrase. That former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton actually devoted more attention to Asia than the incumbent John Kerry. That President Obama has really made very little effort to conclude the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think there was a reference earlier to promiscuity when it comes to trade agreements. Well, the current president is certainly the least promiscuous in recent history when it comes to free trade and trade agreements. There's, you know, a declining US share of trade and investment with ASEAN countries. There's a sense that the American reaction to the new Chinese assertiveness and even bullying in the South China Sea has been somewhat muted. There's concern even about the US treaty commitment to Japan. In short, there is a great deal of worry, at least that I hear in my visits to this part of the world, that the United States is not counterbalancing China, but conceding to China as Beijing pushes outward in search of resources, opportunity, and control. And I think for a nation like Singapore and for many other nations, including the Philippines and Vietnam, a sense of offsetting balance is extremely important. That is to say that China's rise is to be welcomed, but welcomed in the measure that it is not monopolistic, that there is an alternative, that there is the possibility of balancing. But my sense is that Xi Jinping looms increasingly large, whereas President Obama appears weak. There's a feeling of an America in eclipse. Now, of course, we've been here before. After Sputnik, it was the Soviets who were taking over the world. In the 1980s, it was Japan that was taking over. The United States has an unusual capacity to prove the declinists wrong. It is a land of reinvention, constant reinvention. Nevertheless, as George Yeo, I think, indicated, I do think that we are at a very delicate juncture. Historically, it has never occurred that a power of the dimensions of China emerge without conflict or even conflagration. And the great question of our day, as I see it, as Henry Kissinger put it, is whether, perhaps for the first time in history, a rising state, in this instance China, can be incorporated into the international system to strengthen peace and progress, and does not prove so disruptive as to ignite major conflict. And I think it's also clear that the post-1945 order, with the United States as the world's indispensable and ordering power, has begun to unravel. But it's begun to unravel without anyone being sure what will replace it. It was very striking, for example, recently, after the latest flare-up in Gaza with its 2,100 dead. The Secretary of State, John Kerry, went to the region, but which country actually acted as mediator in the ceasefire that was eventually achieved? It was not the United States. It was Egypt. And that, I think, is why we all feel somehow, or many of us do, I certainly do, that the world is more dangerous today than at any time in my lifetime. I wrote a column recently called The Great Unraveling, and it was about this sense of unease. And I don't think I've ever had such a powerful reaction to a column. This somehow struck a chord. There were more than 1,000 comments on the New York Times. It took off in the Twitter sphere. I think part of the reaction to Ebola, maybe I'm reading too much into it, is that it also feels like a metaphor for our time, a time, after all, in which we've seen the plague of beheadings. And the 21st century is in search of a new order, and I suspect it won't find one for some time. Now, what is the state of the United States today? Well, it's war-scarred. It's been through 2 unwon wars. And after this harsh post-9/11 experience, this difficult post-9/11 experience, it has turned inward. It is focused on itself. It's very reluctant to be drawn outward. President Obama is now very much against his will, a war president once again, going after ISIS. But this is not, in general, what the country wants. According to a Pew survey of America's place in the world that's done annually, 52% of Americans currently say that the United States should mind its own business internationally and let other countries get along the best they can on their own. And just 38% disagree with that. Now, that's the most lopsided balance in favor of the United States staying the heck out of other people's affairs that there's been in the 50-year history of that survey. It's also a nation, as you know, that is in political gridlock, huge and often paralyzing partisanship. Politics often seems to be the hostage to money. There's a sense of dysfunction in Washington. And the checks and balances so wisely incorporated into the American Constitution by the Founding Fathers, those checks and balances often seem these days to result in a very unsatisfactory checkmate. And of course, there is an economy that is still working its way through the fallout from the meltdown of 2008. And then I think on top of that, we have the Obama factor. The man who became the US president has not, I think, been the president we imagined. Now, there was a great deal of investing of wild and unreasonable hopes in President Obama after the Bush years. Nevertheless, I think there is a perception of weakness in the White House. I think when a US president says, for example, that President Assad will go, he's history, but sets that objective without having a plan to achieve it, that is a very grave thing. It sends a message that the president is not a man of his word. Similarly, with the setting of a red line in Syria that was then not respected, that again, I think, sent a message of weakness. When there's talk of a pivot to Asia, and the pivot doesn't seem to exist in reality, again, people perceive weakness in the White House. And my own view is that you can't, you have in some ways to link what has happened in the last several months, the annexation of Crimea, the first such act by a major power in Europe since World War II, ISIS's sudden emergence and advance, the new Chinese assertiveness. I think to say that this has nothing to do whatsoever, as some attempt to say, with this perception in the White House, I don't think that holds up. And yet, I think there is a strange duality in the American psyche. George Yeo spoke of the missionary nature of American power. Americans don't like President Obama's foreign policy. It's unpopular. He's translating what Americans want. He's been focusing, at least until very recently, on the home front. But Americans aren't happy with that. They don't like the sense of retreat from the world. They don't like the feeling that America's moment has passed. They don't like to think that the baton is being passed to China. They're unhappy with this notion of retreat. America, after all, is an idea. It is the only nation that is an idea. If you disassociate the United States from the American idea, from the spreading of freedom and democracy around the world, then America ceases to be itself. So there's an almost psychotic duality, I think, in Americans at the moment about their role. They're tired of war. They want concentration on education, on infrastructure, on domestic issues. And yet at the same time, when the president seems to offer them that, they're not happy about it at all. Now, America clearly, in this missionary role it sees for itself, sees itself as exceptional. It has a notion of its exceptionalism. And I think, if I understood him rightly, that George Yeo was arguing that China does not, that China, on the contrary, has raised non-interference to an ordering principle. I don't think I agree with him. I think each nation has a very strong sense of its exceptionalism. And these exceptionalisms are incompatible. On the face of it, they should not be. America's exceptionalism has to do with the spread of freedom. China's exceptionalism, as I understand it, has to do with the conviction that it is a peaceful power. It is a power unique for the fact that it doesn't go to war with other nations, it doesn't impose its will on others, that it spreads harmony. It is exceptional in this regard. That is the Chinese exceptionalism. I imagine that Tibetans, among others, might have something to say about that. So the notion that, in theory, freedom, peace, and harmony, these should all go together. But each understands these ideas in a way that produces an ideological clash. And as a result of that, there's a great deal of misunderstanding, suspicion, and friction right now between the United States and China. So I think one has to be guardedly pessimistic. But I put the stress on guardedly, because if China's goal is a peaceful rise, over the next couple of decades, the worst thing that could happen to it, the worst thing, would be America's retreat as an Asian power. Why? Because the United States' presence in this region is the best guarantee against a Sino-Japanese war and the best guarantee against Japan going nuclear. It's the best guarantee that nations including Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Singapore can profit from China's rise without being squashed by it. It's the best guarantee that India's rise and China's rise can accompany each other and reach an endpoint of balance rather than confrontation. In short, the United States can play for Asia the critical offsetting role that it played for Europe after the Stunde Null, the 0 hour of 1945. But of course, you'll all say, America had inherited the earth in 1945. What it was capable of then, it's certainly not capable of now. And the question has to be, with regard to Asia as anywhere else, can America stay the course? Can the United States still play this critical role I've just described? Well, I've outlined briefly some of America's weaknesses. I've spoken much less of its enduring strengths, but they're there. The United States is still a relatively young country, certainly compared to the nations of Europe. Its demographics are good, far better than Russia's, far better than Europe's. It will be self-sufficient in energy within the next decade. There's a manufacturing revival. The devices I see everybody on Orchard Street using are all plugged into Twitter and Google and WhatsApp and all the other brilliant products that have emerged from Silicon Valley. The United States has a remarkable creativity and the capital to power that creativity, and it has, as I mentioned earlier, a proven capacity for renewal. And, as Lee Kuan Yew himself observed to Joe Nye, and I quote, China can draw on a talent of 1.3 billion people, but the United States can draw on the world's 7 billion people and recombine them in a diverse culture that exudes creativity in a way that ethnic Han nationalism cannot do. So I think on balance, the declinists' case on America is a tough one to make. If you look at the arc of the last 70 years, phases of retreat from the world and re-entry into it have been a constant. After Vietnam, the United States folded inward. It then came back. 20 years from now, on the 30th anniversary of this great institution, I can imagine a headline saying, America is back. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, the United States will be a 21st century Asian power. And how China and America juggle that reality will determine, in significant measure, the course of the century. In Hong Kong, at this very moment, we can see how the human urge of people not to bow to any government to which they have not given their consent will challenge the Chinese model over time. And again, I think, guarded pessimism, with the accent on the guarded, is in order. This area is amazing, this part of the world. Where I spend my time, people are looking back. I covered the wars in the Balkans. I don't know how many conversations I was in that were devoted to events of 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, 200 years ago. The same is true in the Middle East. It's important to remember history. It's important sometimes also to forget history in order to move forward. Amnesia can be a useful tool for a region, at least selective amnesia. And America, I think, is, in its essence, the land of forward-looking reinvention. And Asia today is inhabited by a great burst of lean-forward energy. And however uneasy the partnership is, and I've described, I hope, the reasons for that, it is a needed partnership, and in large measure, a natural one. I would not advise my children to look elsewhere in the world for hope, or for Alibaba's open sesame to fortune. Thank you.
Next we have Joe Studwell. I should have said when I introduced him that he will speak on when will governance matter to China's growth. Joe?
I was asked to speak about governance and institutions, which is a very important and a very difficult and complex subject. It has tripped up academics who are far more intelligent than I am. You're probably aware that, well, in the last couple of years, but it's really been going on for 20 years, that people have tried to write well about the role of institutions in the world and their connection to economic development. And many people have tried it and walked away. They found it to be like trying to make a sculpture with yogurt. You just can't get your hands around this thing. But Donald Lowe in the school was kind enough to ask me to do this. And not only to do it, but he said, you're going to have to do it. When I turned up and saw him at the beginning of the week, he said, oh, by the way, can you do it in 25 minutes? So there we are. A very important, difficult subject in 25 minutes. All right, I focus on China. When will governance matter to China's growth? I start with what I call Sen's razor. Now, Sen refers to Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize-winning Indian economist. You'll have heard of Occam's razor. Sen's razor refers to what Amartya Sen says about this interminable debate about can you have economic development with democracy? I mean, it's gone on here in Singapore for decades, goes on in other places in the world. And other, you know, what's the relationship of freedom of the press to economic development and so on? Amartya Sen says, listen, this whole debate is based on a false distinction, using there the philosopher's term. He says, political development, democratic development, freedom, habeas corpus, all of these things are part of development, along with economic development. And so it is a false distinction to try to separate these things. If you want to be a developed country, you are not just going to have to be rich, you're going to have to be free, you're going to have dignity, you're going to have genuine rule of law and all the rest of the things. So why get involved in what is essentially a sterile debate? Because all of these things are part of development. I think that this is a useful thing to bear in mind when people start to argue about things which perhaps we don't need to argue about, because I don't think many people would disagree that the end point of development would involve maximum dignity and freedom for the individual as well as the group. Okay, so I just start by highlighting that. Now, here, we're not talking about development as a complete thing. We're talking specifically about economic development, so we're leaving the other things behind. Now, my remit was China's economy has grown at 10% a year for 3 decades without clear property rights, without the rule of law, without the development of a free media or a pluralistic civil society. Why was this possible, and are there any lessons from earlier post-Second World War development success stories about when and how governance institutions become a significant variable in economic development? So this is the question that I'm trying to answer. If we just try to distill that a little bit, I think that what we're really asking is the economic impact of institutions stage specific? Is it chronologically sensitive? Are institutions more and less important at different stages of development? Well, the sneak preview to the answer that I'm going to arrive at is that, yes, I think that institutions are stage specific. And I think that this view, this way of approaching the problem, helps us to avoid the kind of black or white answers which I associate with, for instance, a book like Why Nations Fail, which has been tremendously successful as a book, but it says that institutions are always important throughout the whole process. And my personal experience of living for a decade in China and doing work in East Asia for a quarter of a century is that that's just not true. So we move on to select some institutions. I mean, as I said at the beginning, part of the problem with the subject is almost anything is potentially an institution. So let's pick some. We've got property rights, about which a lot has been written. We've got the rule of law. And since we're in a university, let's have education as well as an institution. And I've said that I can't do civil society or a free press and things like that in 20 minutes because they are actually more amorphous, complex institutions, and the data that's available is just poorer as well. So, with that in mind, we move on to China. We start with property rights. Well, what kind of property rights does China have? Very poorly defined. But what China has taught us, I believe, in the last 30 years is that, curiously, in a developing economy, once assets, once property is clearly owned, one thing that you can actually do is increase the incentive to steal stuff. Now, let me try and explain what I mean by this. One of the biggest problems that China has had in reform experiments, the Chinese are very good at experimenting with things that they think they might want to do. One area of experiment that has been a failure so far for them is attempting to privatize state enterprises through management buyouts. I remember a conversation with a businessman in Zhejiang. I like Zhejiang very much because there's personal cultural prejudice, but I believe that Zhejiang is the only province in China where you can ask a Chinese person a straight question and get a completely straight answer. I mean, I just think that's Zhejiang culture. And I asked him about the privatization of some state businesses in Zhejiang. I think we were in Taizhou at the time. And he said to me, that has been the most rotten, corrupt bit of activity that I've seen in my business life. The inside managers of the firms had all the information at their disposal and they have just screwed the state and bought these assets on the cheap. Well, the Chinese government knows this, and this is why so far it's shut down these attempts to, I mean, the end point is you're trying to create property rights. You're trying to have private property rights, move away from unclear or state ownership, but often in China, unclear. Why is it unclear? Well, I'll give you an example. If you go into a state-owned company, and there's still many state-owned companies, or a state unit in China, and you say, who does this belong to? You can get multiple answers. Often, for instance, people will say, well, really, this belongs to its line ministry. Those are the people with the claim on the equity. But then you ask another people, and they say, no. All of this stuff really belongs to the Ministry of Finance. Yeah? And the line ministry is just there to run the operation. They think they own it, but actually it really belongs to the Ministry of Finance. Then you ask another guy, and he will say, no. The Ministry of Finance is part of the government. This country is run by the party. How long have you been here? Have you not realized this? The party runs this country. That thing belongs to the party. Okay, 3 answers about who owns a business. Totally unclear property rights. Theoretically, if you follow Hernando de Soto and people like this, it should be a disaster, but they're growing at 10% a year. Well, how is this possible? My answer is that it actually has compelled the managers of businesses to profit personally by adding value rather than by looting. The point of comparison, the obvious one, is the Russian privatization program of 1992 to 1994. Perfectly clear property rights. There's a voucher system. Businesses privatized the Russian population. Everyone's got a voucher, and you know what you own. You own equity in this business. What happens in this fantastic property rights experiment? The people who've got the vouchers, the public, don't know the value of the thing that they own. Yeah, it's a period of crisis in Russia. So you get the oligarchs, tycoons, godfathers, call them what you want, the guys who own Premiership football clubs. they gain control of banks. When you control a bank, you control capital. They then use the banks to mop up all the equity. And then you wake up and suddenly a bunch of guys control the mineral assets of one of the most mineral-rich countries in the world. Well, if you roll on to today, we're now in this bizarre situation where after someone like Yeltsin, you've got to go to someone like Putin, who's a thoroughly unpalatable character as an individual, but has actually sort of come back in and had to roll back a lot of this stuff that resulted from believing the theory about property rights and the theory about other ways to handle a developing economy. So there's the contrast that I would draw. China, very slow to clarify property rights, 10% growth. Russia, you know, they do what the textbooks say. And where are they? Number two, the rule of law. Does China have the rule of law? No. China does not have the rule of law. China has, and they're very honest about this, China has socialist rule of law. They never lie about this. They say it's socialist rule of law. What does it mean in practice? It means that the political and legal affairs committees at local, provincial, national level, which pay judges, appoint judges, run courts. Well, they don't directly run them, but essentially are the power behind the judicial throne. When you have a sensitive case or an important case, they essentially pre-decide the outcome. That is not the rule of law. That is socialist rule of law. Yeah? The party, it's a Leninist system. The party is deciding what is good for the masses. But they don't lie about it. They don't say we've got rule of law. They do actually always say we've got socialist rule of law. It's only outsiders who don't listen to what they're saying. Well, all right, here we are in Singapore. So I've put at the bottom a deliberate provocation. And my deliberate provocation is that even Singapore does not have what I would call genuine rule of law. And then I've written, you cannot, and I've crossed it out, you have not been able to, I've changed the tense to the past, you have not been able to sue the state and win on sensitive issues. I don't think I can get sued over that remark. I think it's true. Well, all right, so a few laughs. The serious point is that institutions are important, not so much in absolute terms, but in relative terms. Okay, Singapore does not have what Anglo-Saxons would define as true rule of law because the individual does not really have the capacity to sue the state on sensitive issues. But it doesn't matter because Singapore has got rule of law compared with Indonesia or Malaysia. So here you are, all those crumbs that George was talking about keep falling onto your table. But you haven't got absolute rule of law. In the Chinese case, of course, no rule of law, 10% growth. Final one, education. The Chinese system of education is elitist, like Singapore, corrupt, increasingly corrupt. It is widely despised by the population. It also cuts out millions of children of China's 150 million person strong migrant population from formal schooling altogether. And the pedagogy is backwards and subject to anti-academic indoctrination. So they spend quite a lot of time teaching people things that are palpably untrue for political purposes. But China still grows at 10% a year and has done for 30 years. So, you know, what do we get to then? Well, what we get to is it isn't superior institutions in these areas that have made Chinese economic development so successful. Instead, for me, per How Asia Works, the book that I wrote that came out last year, it was, in China, number one, land reform, small-scale, very high-yield agriculture, supported by agricultural extension and farmer-friendly markets, leading to very broad-based distribution of rising incomes in the 1980s. We don't have time to go into it. Agriculture has been tremendously important in the world's most successful fast development stories in Japan, in Korea, in Taiwan, and in China, and the commonality is land reform. They're all land reform countries. Number two, in driving China's economic success for 30 years, an acute focus on manufacturing supported by infrastructure build out. Again, no time to sort of go into detail on that. And third, the facilitating consideration for China's industrialization, financial repression, essentially everything that neoliberals tell you shouldn't do, closely controlled bank-based credit system, and capital controls. I love saying this because you can never say it too much. Outside of a couple of offshore centers, no successful developed country in the world has successfully developed without capital controls. And yet, for 30 years, the IMF has told people, if you want to develop, get rid of capital controls. They're now just changing their story, but it's difficult to believe that they were able to say that. Okay. Is this institution-denying recipe economically good forever? Is the way that China's carried on going to keep it moving in the future? No. No, 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 no. What we're doing here is we're trying to give a bit of stage-based complexity to our discussion about institutions, but nothing works forever. You want your examples? Well, Japan is a classic. You know, they were taking over the world, and they're not taking it over anymore. And I mentioned Italy in Europe, the standout post-Second World War developmental success story, growing for a quarter of a century at 6%, which coming from a higher base was profoundly impressive. Interestingly, they had land reform, they had an industrialization policy, and they had financial repression. I lived for 10 years. I've moved because Italy is now just so stuck that it's a miserable place to be. So what worked for them isn't working for them now. They need to change. Will they change? We don't know. But the point is that there are no permanently good policies. There are just policies that solve particular problems. Well, the final thing is, can we think about why it might be that institutions are stage specific? And maybe in a couple of years I'd like to write a book on this subject, but I'm only just beginning to think about it, so I can do nothing more than throw out a couple of thoughts to you. On property rights, what I see in countries like Italy and Japan is that, first of all, effective industrial policy and financial repression in all the successful developing countries create massive overcapacity. Basically, you rig the market in such a way that domestic credit is unnaturally directed towards your manufacturing and industrial sector. And this produces more firms than you ought to have. You make technological progress, but you create yourself your next problem. And your next problem is you need fewer firms and you need to decide which ones are the best ones. You won't be able to do this as a planner. You need to let the market do it. So you've got to let the market in. Well, unclear property rights, and we're seeing this in China now, very clearly militate against mergers and acquisitions. Because if it's not clear who owns it, or it's not freely tradable, how the hell are you going to buy it? And particularly, how are you going to buy it in a hostile transaction, which becomes much more important as your economy develops? I mean, an example I would throw out would be the Chinese auto industry. China has tried to do something I suspect is impossible, because no one has ever done it. I mean, nothing's theoretically impossible, but I think probably it is impossible, to create state-owned automotive champions. I mean, no one's ever produced a really globally competitive, state-controlled car firm and kept it that way. At the same time, China has produced some more competitive private car firms. But one of the problems that they face is that so much cash flow is in the hands of the state firms that the market is in many ways closed to them. What ought to be possible is for private Chinese capital to take over public Chinese auto firms. But I think at the moment it's impossible to imagine that. It's impossible to imagine because of the claims on ownership. I mean, the equity is there. The shares have been issued. But this equity is not freely tradable because there are people in Beijing who think that ultimately it's theirs. And then there are people, particularly at the local and provincial level, who say, no, 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 no. I mean, it may be a listed company, but I mean, this is our business in our town and our set of vested interests. So I think one area where property rights become important at a later stage is that you need more M&A. You need a proper market in companies in a way that you don't at an earlier stage of industrial policy. So I would suggest that. On the rule of law, you know, what strikes me is that in economic terms, as you get richer, it's an absence of rule of law as you get richer, a serious absence of rule of law like China has, as a country gets richer, essentially provides protection for vested interests and for people who are corrupt and for firms and people who are inefficient and even lazy. Lazy is an interesting thing. Everyone works hard in the first generation of a developing country, and then their kids begin to realize that there's more to life than just work. And then you get the phenomenon which people would have thought was impossible 20 years ago. I taught a student last year, a Korean, who was very lazy. I don't think that 20 years ago anyone could imagine that a Korean could be lazy, but then now Koreans are beginning to be lazy. You know, you need new mechanisms to deal with this kind of thing. In terms of rule of law, also, of course, the vested interests that the rule of law allows to be taken on get much bigger by virtue of economic success. When a country's poor, there's not actually that much worth stealing. When a country is as rich as China has now become at $8,000 GDP per capita, there's lots of stuff worth stealing. And that's why it's a more serious issue that you don't have an effective and more independent judicial system, and that you're attempting to tackle corruption simply by the traditional Chinese method of the yanda, of the strike hard campaign. Well, that's that one. Education, I think that once you start to compete with the big boys, which is to say us, in human capital terms, not me personally, I'm not a big boy, but I mean us in terms of developed countries, then you need to take more of the population with you. When you start out as a developing country, small numbers of, I mean, Singapore's a classic example. Small numbers of people can drag society forward. You know, the so-called pioneers of a place like Singapore. Small numbers of people drag large numbers of people forwards, because what are you doing? You're doing things like industrial planning behind the technology curve. Small numbers of people are saying, well, we need to do that, that, and that, because everybody who's been successful has done those things, and so let's just get on with it. And Japan, China, Singapore, Taiwan, Korea are all characterized by small, highly motivated, highly effective bureaucracies in their core developmental eras. But I would suggest that going forward in the next 10 or 20 years, and I think this is already clear, the game is beginning to change. The most competitive societies in the world will take a much bigger proportion of their societies with them in human capital terms, in terms of really mobilizing more deeply the human capital resources of a society. It won't be enough to be just an elite led society. Now, if you look back the last 20, 30 years, we've lived through the era of financialization. At the firm level, companies have competed very aggressively through financial engineering, through making capital work harder, and industries from retail to banking have been revolutionized by this. It went too far, and this was part of the reason for the global financial crisis. Moving forward, I think a dimension that we are going to see companies competing in much more is through human capital, real deep development of human capital. Again, I mean, I always look at firms and begin from the firm level. If you look at the firm level in multinational businesses, the tradition has been, typical tradition has been that human resource manager for a multinational firm has been a woman. And it's been a woman who is not going to become the CEO. There's been a very powerful element of tokenism about people who get that human resource job. Going forward, that I don't think is going to be the case. Going forward, the person doing the human resource job is going to be either a man or a woman who will go on to be the CEO of the business, just like so many CFOs in the financialization era went on to be the CEO of the business. So there will be more friction, I think, from the education sector as an institution than there has been in the past. And that's partly just a shift, a secular shift in what's going on globally in the world. So we reached the conclusion, and it is that institutions are a stages story, at least for me. And institutions are becoming more important to China's economic potential. And Xi Jinping is not much interested in two of the institutions that I've mentioned. And I'll leave you to guess which ones you think he's less interested in, which one he's more interested in. So I think China's going to see some friction going forward, but it's not terminal from a Chinese perspective. But the question is answered fundamentally by saying that, yes, institutions are very important, but they're also very time-specific. And that's the end.
And I'd like to invite you to use them. All right, Sheikh Lubnazar first.
Joe, how do you explain to the Chinese the downfall of economic crises and financial crises in a highly developed world that has so much of governance, transparency, exercise rule of the law, IMF-led, and everything else? How could you justify the failings of all the stuff that happened in the financial world? It's not just the greed itself, but there were existing checks and balances. How do you justify that to the Asian world that's trying to catch up with them?
Well, I mean, I would justify it to them by saying that, you know, the financialization of the world. I mean, I follow Minsky on this. If you read economics, I mean, I think that Hyman Minsky's book, he only really wrote one book, and I just think it's the best book that's been written on this subject. I mean, Minsky simply pointed out that ever since the end of Bretton Woods, you have this pattern in the financial sector whereby people who are very clever with financial instruments are perpetually trying to stretch money. And of course, you can stretch money with a fractional banking system because you create new instruments. You know, whether it was in the 60s, certificates of deposits, or in the 2000s, you know, new types of debt obligation. So everyone's trying to stretch money the whole time, and it's just a nightmare for regulators to keep their hands around this, because you've got such creative people who are doing it, also motivated by very large amounts of money. I mean, they're being paid a lot more money than the people who are being paid to regulate them. So, yes, I mean, I see that as it is. My view on this has always been that the only rational way to deal with it is to put a huge, great line between banking and speculative capital. You know, I think the solution that was reached after the 1929 crisis is better in some respects than what we're getting. Although we're getting something pretty close with the Volcker rule in the US. So I don't think they've gone for a clean enough solution in terms of the regulation, but of course, I mean, the banks are they have tremendous lobbying resources. Bankers do believe that they're doing God's work. I don't know where they get the idea from, but anyway, they do believe it, some of them. And they've managed to get a sort of a fudge in terms of, but what I would say to the Chinese is, you see it from the sort of British and American point of view, because we are talking about an Anglo-Saxon financial system here. See it from our point of view. Go to New York and go to London and see what's going on. It's humming. It's humming because in the end, what matters more than the global crisis to the narrow interests of New York and London is that the system operates according to a system and rules that suit us and that suit the interests of the financial sector. And so that has broadly been preserved. Beyond that, there are many problems in the UK and the US. But when I look at the world, I mean, I found it very difficult the way that people have read what's gone on in the last 6 years as a single crisis, because to me it's always been two separate crises. One is an Anglo-Saxon financial crisis that affected the UK and the US and countries that followed their economic model, which would include Ireland and Spain. And the other is this kind of crisis that has just been like seeing an oil tanker come over the horizon that has been coming at us forever, which is the continental European crisis of our European fast growth countries, most obviously France and Italy after the Second World War, which applied a lot of what economists call rigidities in order to achieve rapid economic development. But then, as Engels pointed out in the 1880s, the only problem with protection is getting rid of it afterwards. They've been unable to deregulate and open up their economies, and this creates a debt problem, which through financial markets creates very large liabilities for other people. So it's been two separate crises going on at the same time, and I think that, there's markets have been panicking again recently about Europe, and they're right to panic because we've come out of the Anglo-Saxon crisis, but we're still in that other European crisis. They are two different things.
Thank you. Tan Sui Chair, NTUC. Just to respond to your conversation just ended, the very fact that you have a global financial crisis from New York and a European crisis demonstrate that even with some institutions, you will have problems. You will have problems, yeah. But to go back to your earlier talk, where I found it interesting the way you frame the problem definition, right? Because your assertion is that some institutions is necessary for sustainable growth or good growth. And then you went on with a fairly Western-centric analysis by using property rights, legal rights, and education. I will concede to you on property rights and legal rights for China, but not education, and say that even without those three, China could grow. But I could offer a counter-analysis and ask you what you think about it. For Singapore and in China, it's about context, it's about leadership, it is about the political party as an institution. If you look at the growth of Singapore, it grew out from an inflection point in the 60s of crisis response. And Deng Xiaoping's transformation of China grew out from an inflection point of the Cultural Revolution as well, under a destructive. So he has the ingredients to have an S-curve. And of course, Deng Xiaoping also made use of an institution called the Communist Party of China in the agitation of the entrepreneurial energies of China. Whether it could sustain beyond the S-curve remains the question of the time, right? Because then whether you need institutions. But by the previous conversation, we are implying that even with good institutions, you could have failures. You could have failures. Yeah. So I'll be interested on your take about how you see context leadership as well as a political party as an institution.
Yeah. Well, leadership is. I don't think leadership is an institution because leadership is about individuals. And I personally, I'm like Ha-Jin Chang, I think that leadership is extremely important. a lot of, I mean, you say I'm Western-centric, but actually a lot of Western people shy away from emphasizing leadership because they somehow see it as, do they see it as sort of anti-democratic or something? Or maybe they see it as sort of suggesting that authoritarianism might be okay. But I just look at this and I just notice that leadership has been terribly important in countries that have succeeded. It doesn't matter whether you're the Meiji oligarchs, it doesn't matter whether you're Lee Kuan Yew, it doesn't matter whether you do touchy-feely European leadership like Olof Palme, who changed the future of Sweden, produced one of the most under-remarked and extraordinary modernization, industrialization processes the world has ever seen, and just somehow managed to reason with the Swedes about what needed to be done and what needed to be sacrificed. So leadership is always fantastically important. And then the contacts thing, so the Guanxi thing is essentially what every society does when you can't trust people because the legal system doesn't work. So I mean, I lived in Italy for 10 years after China, and there's just as much Guanxi in Italy as there is in China because the legal system in Italy is almost as crappy as it is in China. So I think that you know, it's another stage thing. I mean, human beings are very resourceful, and they compensate for missing institutions by finding ways around problems, and the way that people get around poor institutional infrastructure, and particularly rule of law problems, is to work through relationships and build trust at an individual level, rather than waiting for a weak government which is unable to provide it at a societal level. So that would be my answer. I'm sure Roger has some.
No, I would only contest your view that the Italian legal system is almost as bad as the Chinese.
Okay.
I think it is categorically worse than the Chinese.
But there are a couple more people to ask questions, but I thought on the leadership issue, I might just come to Roger, because you said that Obama is perceived as being weak, and that you've been yourself quite critical of him. Do you see anything that he could really do to kind of restore his presidency in the last couple of years? We're going into midterm elections in the United States, such that the United States can make a comeback in Asia, for instance, but also deal with problems in Syria and now the mounting Ebola crisis?
Well, I think he has to learn the lesson of what I spoke about, which is setting objectives for which he has not determined the means. And I personally would favor a change in his national security and foreign policy team, which has involved the true faithfuls, McDonough, Ben Rhodes, Susan Rice, all the way through. People very much committed to preserving as far as they could the aura of the president, but not people with a great deal of hard-knuckle experience in the ways of the world. And I think what we've seen in Syria has ended up being immensely damaging to the presidency, to this president, in the name of caution. These aides were constantly counseling against getting involved. But at the outset, of course, Syria was an uprising similar to what had occurred in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and elsewhere. It then morphed into the locus of an epochal Sunni-Shia clash in the form of a civil war that has now torn up the Sykes-Picot order and destroyed borders and seen the birth of IS, and after all, it was 12 years ago that the United States went to war in Afghanistan because it had become the fiefdom of Al-Qaeda. Well, now you have something a lot closer. So I think President Obama has to. It's no good when the President of the United States says we hit singles. Maybe if we're lucky, we hit a double. But, you know, we can't do a whole lot. He's the most powerful man in the world. Even if you think that, you don't say it. You don't say, we don't have a strategy for ISIS. You may not have a strategy for ISIS, but you have to be damn sure you don't say it until you do. And so these, I think, are fairly fundamental mistakes. And, you know, perception, I mean, clearly, you know, policy is important, but so is perception. And I think there's a perception of a weakness, and I do think that the president could turn that around.
I don't know. I mean, I just add one thing. I mean, there's one sort of practical issue that I see, and you know, thinking institutions. You know, maybe there's an institutional problem in America. I mean, Obama. I mean, I think stuff that you've written probably bears this out. Yeah, Obama has created. He's got a bunch of people inside the White House, and he's listened to them, and then listened to his own counsel as well. This is the United States. You know, when you look at the CIA, the NSA, the State Department, the Pentagon, this has the biggest informational resources. It's phenomenally powerful, influence. And then you get presidents. But I mean, Obama's not new at doing this. I mean, I've seen it before. And then you've got all these amazing resources. People actually know what the bloody hell they're talking about and know what goes on in these places, and you don't listen to them.
Yeah, well, he's fairly famous for being rather a cold personality and then relying very much on his own intelligence. And there's something somewhat...
I mean, if I may, Candy, I was just a small anecdote, which to me was very telling on that point of this feeling of aloofness or distance that he gives, and of being a professional. And I'm not sure Americans like professionals in the White House. They like something more. But I was being told by a European ambassador who recently arrived in a major European nation that he felt that it would be a nice idea on his piano to have a photograph of himself with the president. It'd be a nice thing for guests to see when they came to the house and so on. So not long after, he found himself in the Oval Office accompanying the leader of said state. And when the leader departed, he had the temerity to suggest, you know, would you mind if we just had a quick photo taken? The president, in his words, leapt back about a yard and said that, well, no, that's not, you know, that we can't do that. And you know, that I think is an indication of how controlled. There's very little spontaneity, and that can be important.
Okay, well, our questioners here have been very patient. I'm going to go to the lady here first.
Hi, my name is Somang. I'm an alumnus of the LKY School and currently working as a consultant. My first question is to Mr. Studwell. In How Asia Works, you chronicled the rise of East Asian countries such as Taiwan, South Korea. Do you think that this model, this growth model, is replicable for current developing countries in the post-manufacturing, post-mass industrialization phase? And the other is just a general observation, and perhaps Mr. Cohen can comment on this. The most competitive societies, as you mentioned, are perhaps the United States, where 1% or even the top 0.1% has been getting richer and richer, as exemplified by the founders of Facebook and WhatsApp and all the other apps that you mentioned. So is the implication for educational policy now that we should be sensible and instead of trying to spend a lot of money on comprehensive public education reforms, to try and focus on helping the top tier elite students get further ahead and helping them become, I guess, more brilliant and reach their potential, since they will be bringing along a bigger portion of the society?
Okay, all right, go back there.
This is Justin Kuan here, and I'm actually a member of the public and a graduate from Curtin University. And my own question is specifically to Mr. Cohen. I just needed to ask with regards about your being the US being resurgent and an Asian power. I personally would have some serious doubts about whether can it truly be able to be one when it still has got massive amounts of debt. I mean, of fiscal debt.
Okay, thank you. Lady in front.
Hi, Vivian Liu. Mr. Cohen, you had mentioned that American presence in Asia is essentially provides some buffer space for countries like Singapore so that we benefit from but don't get squashed by countries like China. And that position certainly has merit. With respect to the incursions in Crimea and the ongoing actions in Ukraine, I'm curious then why the international community, as led by the US and the EU, have not taken stronger action earlier, given that this provides obviously Putin and other potential aggressors the opportunity and the encouragement, if any were needed, to be more aggressive in looking after national interests. I'm thinking, of course, of the South China Sea dispute as well, which Asia is obviously quite concerned about. So if you could comment on how that's consistent with safeguarding regional and global security in the short and medium run. And Mr. Studwell, I have a comment and question as well. You said that property rights in China essentially precludes M&A, but as we know, China obviously has been a major driver of mergers and acquisitions. I myself had the opportunity to serve on one, the strategic stake sale of China Mobile to Vodafone. So there obviously is a pathway for assets in companies to be defined, allocated, and carved out. How then do you view the M&A space in China over the last few decades, given your comment? Thank you.
All right. So would you like to go first, Roger? And then,
okay. Well, maybe I'll take them in reverse order. Well, in answer to your question, I do not think it is good for world order when the United States, for example, and I mentioned this, sets a red line, and then that red line is seen to be meaningless. And I don't think it's for nothing that the events you described, the annexation of Crimea, the fomenting of a little war in the eastern part of Ukraine on the grounds that the largest nation in the world somehow felt encircled and humiliated by the post-1989 encroachments of the West. It's not unrelated to that. Putin clearly felt that he had a hand to play that had been gifted to him, and he's proved not to be wrong. I mean, it's not easy to know how to respond, but I have been very struck and very alarmed by the passivity of the United States and the EU, which I guess for me culminated when hundreds of bodies, including the corpses of, I think, more than 100 Dutch citizens, maybe not quite that many, Victor will correct me, but many, many Dutch citizens, lay rotting in the sun in the cornfields of the Ukraine for days. And the West, these institutions, these powers that I have always believed in, hardly seem capable of lifting a finger. There's a great deal of energy dependency, of course, in the European Union on Russia. In some quarters, there's a kind of intellectual fascination with Russia, including on the left and on the right in Germany. Putin has cultivated, while denouncing the fascists of the Ukraine, he has cultivated the proto-fascists of Western European societies. It's all been fairly odious and dispiriting, but and I think the word of the United States at the moment carries diminished value. That's why I was very alarmed when President Obama, on his trip to Asia recently, when asked a question, I think, in the Philippines about Article 5 of the Japan Treaty, appeared to leave a little daylight there. You can't leave daylight on on the treaty obligations of the United States, whether in Europe or in Japan, unless you want a global free-for-all. This is extremely combustible. It is very dangerous to do such a thing, and I find it very alarming. On debt and the United States, you're right. I mean, clearly this is a crimping factor for the US. All I was trying to suggest is that the American story is not over. This is a difficult moment, but I think it's an ephemeral one. I would bet that over the next decade, the declinists would be proved wrong, and that the United States will, as I said in my speech, despite what is hanging over it now and weighing it down, will revive. Finally on education matter, no. Please, don't just educate elites and hope they invent a WhatsApp. I think the fragmentation within societies, not only of the West, but also in Asia and to some degree even in Singapore today, the fragmentation due to the increasingly large disparity between the earnings of the very wealthy, the super wealthy, the masters of the universe, the hedge fundies, the mega wealthy, and the poor, not to mention, of course, the middle class who are indebted and struggling to get by. This is a central and cardinal problem of societies moving forward in the 21st century. And the answer to that is to broaden and improve education for everybody, not to try to focus on a narrow elite.
Well, I think Roger should get a column because almost everything he says is true. He's particularly right about the requirement for the United States to lead. The US has got to continue to lead. We in Europe are politically hopeless. And we're politically hopeless partly, and I say this with deep shame, because of us Brits. We will not work with the Europeans. We won't contribute seriously, I feel, to making Europe a really effective political force. I mean, of course, Europe needs to move in our direction in terms of the economic stuff, but politically, we are an empire past our sell-by date with no more colonies that retains the contemptuous attitude that empires have. And, you know, we need to get rid of that. So, well, good luck with that anyway. Yes. So I think I've just got two things to deal with. The lady talked about M&A in China. She said there's M&A in China. I mean, the example that you gave, I think, is sort of China Mobile selling a little bit of equity to Vodafone. That's not M&A. That's just selling a little bit of equity. A merger and acquisition is a merger of two businesses or an acquisition. And I made the point that what's particularly important is hostile takeovers, because this is the sort of creative destruction that produces new forms, consolidates companies, and so on and so forth. And so I stand by what I said, that effective industrial policy creates overcapacity, and you then need to move to the other medicine. You need to go through your Adam Smith moment. I mean, everybody, you know, this is why economists are so annoying, is because they never historically contextualize anything that they say. I mean, Adam Smith arrives in Britain in the late 18th century, a point in which Britain has become the world's dominant technological power through A, violence, which is to say colonialism, and B, very effective sort of early industrial policy, protectionism. You know, you couldn't trade in a British port unless you had a British flag. We call them the series of navigation acts, we call them. And Adam Smith comes in and says, oh, right, this needs to change now because we are the world leaders, and when you're the technological leaders of the world, get everybody to trade freely. It's basically being, you know, Chelsea Football Club and saying, right, we will take on any third division team that wants to have a game on equal terms. You know, that's essentially you know, the sensible way to proceed. So Smith was completely right, but he was also historically specific. Oh well, the replicability of what is said in how Asia works. Well, I mean, it's the recipe that's worked in Japan, in Taiwan, in Korea, now in China, and with Vietnam as a trailing, weak trailing follower of that model. It's clearly not, doesn't sort of seem to be about the climate or the temperature or the resources, because those countries I've mentioned, some are resource rich, some are resource poor, some are hot, some are cold. The only way you can try and sort of spin something that says it's not to do with the policies they pursued is to sort of say that somehow they're all, I mean, I had this question a couple of days ago, somehow they're all Confucian connected. But I mean, go and tell a Vietnamese that they're basically the same as the Chinese, and hopefully they'll just punch you. I don't think there is a cultural explanatory. I think it is about policy. The gentleman earlier who asked about leadership, absolutely about leadership. You know, societies are still changed by small numbers of people who lead from the front. Leadership does become less important as you become richer, because there's more, you know, society becomes more atomistic. But even in the richest countries, leadership is desperately important in America, in Britain.
Let me just stop it there. Please join me in thanking both our speakers.